An old man kneels on a slab of black volcanic rock, and the wind off the sea will not stop. His name is John. He is the last living man who walked beside Jesus of Nazareth. And now he is old, and he is alone, and the Roman Empire has exiled him to a prison island called Patmos for the crime of refusing to stop talking about what he saw. There is no wall around him. He does not need one. The sea is wall enough. And on this island, on this rock, something happens to him that he will spend the rest of his strength trying to write down. A voice, a vision, a door standing open in the sky. You are about to find out what he saw, but not yet. Because to understand the last page John wrote, you have to go back to the first page anyone wrote. Back past the prison island, back past the empire, back past 1,000 years of kings and prophets and shepherds and wars, to a garden and two people, and a silence that once had no fear in it at all. Here's what most people miss about the Bible. They think of it as one book. It is not. It is a library. 66 separate scrolls and letters, written across roughly 1,500 years by more than 40 different authors. They included shepherds, kings, fishermen, a physician, a tax collector, and a persecutor turned preacher, most of whom never met each other. They wrote in 3 different languages, on 3 different continents. And yet, open it from the first page to the last, and you find something that should not be possible. A single story, a single argument, a single thread pulled taut from a garden in Genesis to a city in Revelation. This is not a rule book of ancient regulations. This is not a dusty history textbook for people who like old wars. This is not a loose collection of unrelated stories that happen to get bound together by accident. This is a library with a plan. And by the end of this video, you will see that plan for yourself, how it moves, why the order matters, and what every single section is actually trying to tell you. You will meet a shepherd who argued with a burning bush, a king who danced in the street and wept in the dark, a prophet who warned a nation and was ignored, a doctor who tracked down eyewitnesses to write the most careful biography in the ancient world, and an old man on a rock, staring at a door in the sky, about to see something that will make sense of everything that came before it. You will meet a foreign widow who refused to abandon the mother-in-law who had nothing left to offer her. You will meet a weeping prophet who watched his entire city burn and kept writing anyway. And you will meet fishermen who scattered in terror on the worst night of their lives, and somehow, not long after, could not stop talking about what they had seen. There is one detail buried in the very last chapter John will write on this island, one sentence, so quiet you could miss it, that reaches all the way back to the very first chapter ever written. A garden lost, a garden found. We will get there. Stay with me. First, you need to understand how this library begins, and who decided it should be organized this way at all. A first-century Jewish historian named Josephus, writing decades after John's own lifetime, described the Hebrew Scriptures as a fixed, trusted collection. He said it held 22 sacred books, guarded so carefully by his people that, in his words, no one had ever dared to add, remove, or alter a single syllable. That kind of care did not happen by accident. It tells you something about how seriously the earliest readers treated the order and shape of what you are about to walk through. The library opens with 5 books scholars call the Torah, and if you only remember one thing from this section, remember this. Torah does not simply mean law. It is a Hebrew word that means instruction, teaching, the kind of thing a parent gives a child, not merely the kind of thing a judge hands down in a courtroom. That distinction changes everything about how you should read what comes next. You meet Moses first, and you meet him badly. He is 80 years old, a fugitive shepherd hiding in the wilderness after killing a man decades earlier, tending someone else's sheep on the far side of nowhere. He has spent so long in exile that he has practically forgotten who he used to be. And then a bush catches fire in front of him and does not burn up. You can imagine the sound of his own breath catching in his throat. A voice comes out of the fire, and it does not introduce itself with a title or a rank. It says, "I am that I am." 4 words that Jewish scholars have spent 3,000 years trying to fully unpack, because they are not really a name. They are closer to a declaration of pure, uncaused existence. Everything else exists because something else caused it. This voice claims to be the only exception. Moses argues with the voice. 4 separate times he argues. You would too. He is not a hero stepping confidently into his calling. He is a stuttering old man with a criminal record, being handed a job he does not want, by a God who will not take no for an answer. And you can hear, underneath his excuses, something almost every viewer of this video has felt at some point. The fear of being asked to do something far bigger than you feel equipped to do. That is the first book. The next 4, Leviticus, Numbers, and the rest of the Torah, follow a nation of former slaves stumbling through a desert for 40 years. They learn slowly and painfully what it means to belong to this God who insists on being close. Along the way, you meet a nation that complains about the food and worships a golden statue, while their rescuer is still on the mountain receiving instructions on their behalf. They repeatedly wonder out loud whether slavery back in Egypt was actually the safer option. It is not a flattering portrait of anyone involved, and yet the same pages record daily provision, a cloud by day and fire by night, guiding people who complained about it almost the entire way. Leviticus, the book people most often give up on reading, is not random ritual for its own sake. It is a manual for how a holy God and an unholy people can share the same camp without either one destroying the other. Numbers tracks the cost of their fear, an entire generation who refused to trust the promise at the border of the land and spent the rest of their lives wandering because of it. Deuteronomy is Moses' final sermon, delivered to their children, urging them not to repeat their parents' mistake. Here is where it gets stranger. When the Torah ends, Moses does not get to finish the journey. He dies within sight of the promised land, close enough to see it, never close enough to enter it. So leadership falls to Joshua, a former spy who once scouted the very land Moses never got to walk into. The book bearing his name and the books that follow it, Judges, Ruth, the books of Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, are what scholars call the history section. Here, the emotional temperature of the library shifts. This is not tidy instruction anymore. This is a nation trying, failing, trying again. The book of Judges cycles through the same heartbreaking pattern again and again. The people forget God, disaster falls, someone unlikely rises up to rescue them, and peace lasts a generation, then they forget again. You meet judges like Deborah, a prophetess and the only woman to lead Israel in this entire period, and Gideon, a frightened farmer who hides in a winepress threshing wheat, terrified of the enemy raiders who might see him. The point of Judges is not that these leaders were impressive. Almost none of them were. The point is that God kept sending someone, however unlikely, every single time. You feel the grief early. An entire generation of former slaves dies in the wilderness before their children are even allowed to cross into the land they were promised, because their fear at the border, decades earlier, cost them the very thing they had been walking toward their whole lives spent almost arriving. Joshua leads the crossing itself with a kind of quiet resolve. 12 stones pulled from the riverbed and stacked on the far shore, a monument so that generations not yet born would ask what those stones meant and be told the story all over again. That is one of the quiet threads running through this entire section of the library. Memory matters. Forgetting is treated as a kind of danger, almost as serious as outright rebellion. But it gets stranger still, because tucked into this bloody, brutal, honest history section is a tiny 4-chapter book about a Moabite widow named Ruth, a foreigner with no right to belong to Israel at all, who chooses loyalty to her mother-in-law over the safety of going home. And that choice puts her in the direct family line of the next major character in the story, David. You meet him as the youngest of 8 sons, so unimportant that his own father does not bother calling him in from the fields when the prophet Samuel comes looking for Israel's next king. He is a shepherd boy. He smells like sheep, and the prophet anoints him anyway, oil running down over hair still dusty from the pasture, while his older brothers stand there stunned. David is not a simple hero. He dances half-naked through the streets of Jerusalem in pure, unguarded joy before the Ark of God, not caring who is watching. And decades later, that same man will weep alone in the dark, undone by grief and guilt after his own sin costs a child's life. The history books do not flatter their king. They show you both nights, Later still, his own son Absalom will lead a rebellion against him, and David will weep again, this time for a son who tried to kill him, showing you a grief so tangled it has no easy name. After David, his son Solomon inherits the throne, and for a while, everything looks like the peak of the entire nation's story. Solomon builds a temple so magnificent that visiting rulers travel great distances just to see it with their own eyes. But even Solomon's wisdom cannot protect him from his own choices, and by the end of his reign, the seeds of the kingdom's eventual collapse are already planted. The books of Kings and Chronicles then track roughly 4 centuries of monarchs after him, some faithful, most not. Eventually, both halves of the divided kingdom fall to foreign empires, and the survivors are marched into exile far from the land any of this started in. Pay attention to this. The library you are reading was never trying to present flawless people. Moses stutters and argues. Joshua inherits a war he did not start. Ruth is a foreigner nobody expected to matter. David dances and weeps and fails and repents, sometimes in the same chapter. This entire opening section, 5 books of Torah, 12 books of history, is not really about heroes at all. It is about a God who keeps showing up for people who are nowhere near ready for him. Here is where you should notice the shape of what you have just walked through. 17 books, 5 of instruction, 12 of history, a shepherd who argued with God, a successor who inherited an unfinished war, a foreign widow who chose loyalty over safety, a shepherd king who danced in joy and wept in shame, sometimes within the same year. None of them arrived polished. All of them were used anyway. If that pattern is starting to feel familiar, good. It should, because it is about to repeat itself in a completely different key. If a video like this has been useful so far, this is the moment to hit subscribe, because the next section is where most people give up on reading the Bible in order, and it is also where it stops sounding like a history book and starts sounding like a diary. Something shifts here that changes everything about how you read what comes next. It gets personal fast. After the history books, the library changes its voice completely. You move into what scholars call the poetry and wisdom section: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and here for the first time you are not reading about people. You are reading their actual words to God, unfiltered. Job is a wealthy man who loses everything in a single day: his children, his wealth, his health, and spends 30-some chapters demanding an explanation he never fully receives. Nobody softens his pain for you. His friends try to explain his suffering with tidy theology, insisting he must have deserved it somehow, and the book itself seems to say they were wrong to try. When God finally speaks near the end, he does not explain the suffering at all. He simply reveals how much bigger the universe is than Job's understanding of it, and somehow that is enough. You may have noticed by now that this section refuses to give you tidy answers to the hardest questions. Job never learns exactly why he suffered. He is simply reminded that the God who set the boundaries of the ocean and calls out the stars by name is not obligated to explain himself to be trusted. Then you reach the Psalms, 150 songs and prayers. More than half of them traditionally credited to David, the same shepherd king from the history books. And here is what nobody tells you about the Psalms. They are not polite. David does not whisper reverent little prayers. He shouts. He accuses God of abandoning him. He begs for his enemies to be destroyed. And then, sometimes in the very next verse, he says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," with the kind of trust that only makes sense if you already know how honest his rage was 3 verses earlier. Here's the part nobody tells you. The Bible does not remove your anger before it lets you approach God with it. It hands you the exact words. Now watch what happens next, because the tone shifts again. After the raw honesty of the Psalms comes Proverbs, short, practical, almost blunt wisdom for daily life, written largely by David's son Solomon. Then Ecclesiastes, where an older, wearier voice, likely that same Solomon now aged and disillusioned, looks back at a life of wealth and pleasure and power and calls almost all of it meaningless, chasing after wind. And then, strangely tucked right after that weariness, comes Song of Solomon, a book of romantic, even tender, poetry about love between a husband and wife. Grief and pleasure and love side by side with no apology for any of it. There's one more thing this section is doing that you may not have noticed. It is teaching you that the Bible is not afraid of your full emotional range, not the tidy version of you, all of you. And this is where it gets remarkable, because the next section takes that same emotional honesty and points it forward in time. The prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and a dozen shorter books after them are not primarily fortune tellers predicting distant events for entertainment. In Hebrew, they are called the Nevi'im, which simply means those who speak for another. Their job was to say, on behalf of God, here is what is actually happening beneath the surface of your nation, and here is where it is heading if nothing changes. Isaiah writes during one of the most dangerous political moments in Israel's history, the 8th century before Christ, when the Assyrian Empire is swallowing nation after nation whole, and Jerusalem is next on the list. You can picture the fear in that city, watching neighboring kingdoms fall one after another, wondering whose turn was coming next. He is not a fringe voice, he is a trusted court advisor with access to kings. And in the middle of warning his own people about coming disaster, Isaiah writes something strange, something that reaches far past his own lifetime. He describes a suffering figure who would be wounded for the wrongdoing of others, a rescuer who had not yet arrived. A century later, Jeremiah takes up the same calling in a far darker season, watching the very disaster Isaiah once warned about finally arrive. He weeps openly through his entire book, so much so that history remembers him as the weeping prophet, and he watches Jerusalem itself burn to the ground. Not long after him, a priest named Ezekiel, already dragged into exile in Babylon, sees visions so strange that readers still argue over them today. Wheels within wheels, valleys of dry bones rising to life all point to the same stubborn promise. This nation is not finished, even though it feels finished. You can imagine what it must have felt like to be one of those exiles, sitting beside a foreign river, homeland gone, temple burned, singing songs about a city you might never see again. The Babylonian Talmud, the vast collection of rabbinic teaching compiled centuries later, still preserves the memory of that exile as one of the defining wounds of the entire Jewish story. It's a wound this section of the library refuses to look away from. Pay close attention here, because the prophets do something most readers never expect. Warning and hope are woven through the exact same pages. Judgment on one line and on the next, a promise that the story is not over. And here is the part that catches most readers off guard. The Old Testament does not end on a note of triumph. It ends with a short book called Malachi, written after the exiles have returned home, rebuilt their temple, and settled back into the same old patterns of half-hearted worship. And Malachi's final words are a promise that before the great and dreadful day arrives, a messenger will be sent to prepare the way. And then silence. 400 years of it, no prophet speaks, no new scroll is added. The library simply stops, mid-sentence, on a promise, and the people wait in a silence that stretches across 16 generations. Generations are born, live, and die during this silence, never once hearing a new word from the God their ancestors had followed out of Egypt centuries earlier. Empires rise and fall around them, Persian, Greek, and finally Roman, and still no prophet speaks. This is not a gap in the story. This is not a lost chapter that got misplaced somewhere in history. This is not evidence that God had walked away. It is, if you read what comes next, closer to the quiet before someone you love walks back through the door. Hold that thought, because that silence is about to break in the most unexpected way possible. 400 years of silence ends, and it does not end with thunder. It ends with a physician picking up a pen. His name is Luke, a Gentile doctor, a careful and methodical man, traveling for years alongside a former persecutor named Paul who now preaches the very faith he once tried to destroy. Luke was not an eyewitness to Jesus of Nazareth. He tells you this himself, in the opening lines of his book, that he had carefully investigated everything from the beginning, tracking down the people who were actually there, so that he could write, in his words, an orderly account. This matters more than it sounds like it should. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are not legend passed down through centuries of embellishment. Luke is doing the work of a first-century historian, interviewing witnesses, while many of them are still alive to be questioned. Each of the four writers tells the story from a different angle, for a different audience. The way four witnesses to the same event might each notice different details worth remembering. Matthew writes for a Jewish audience steeped in the prophets, constantly showing how Jesus fulfills promise after promise. Mark moves fast and urgent, a gospel built for action, short on speeches, long on movement. John, writing decades after the others, slows everything down and lingers on long, intimate conversations the earlier writers left out entirely. The Greek word for what all four of these books actually are is euangelion. It means good news, not a biography written for flattery. Breaking news, written down by people close enough to the events to be held accountable for getting it wrong. And what Luke and the others describe is a life that begins as quietly as anything in this entire library. A teenage girl, a stable, a silence broken not by a prophet this time, but by an infant's first cry. And it ends 3 decades later with an execution, and then, according to every single one of these four accounts, an empty tomb that none of them expected and all of them had to explain. You can feel the weight of that claim even now. Everything the Torah pointed toward, everything the history books stumbled through, everything the Psalms cried out for, everything the prophets promised across 4 centuries of silence, Luke and Matthew and Mark and John are telling you it landed. Here, in a specific place, at a specific time, in front of specific named ordinary people. After the Gospels comes Acts, Luke's second volume, following the earliest church as it explodes outward from a small upper room in Jerusalem into cities across the entire Roman world. You watch ordinary fishermen and tax collectors, men who scattered in fear the night Jesus was arrested, suddenly stand in public squares and speak with a courage that gets some of them beaten and eventually killed for it. Something happened to change them, and Acts insists on telling you exactly what that something was. Paul, the same man Luke traveled alongside, becomes the central figure. He preaches in city squares while soldiers watch from doorways, in a dye merchant's shop beside a woman named Lydia who would risk everything to be baptized, and in a prison cell in chains. Eventually, he writes letters from that same captivity that would become half of the New Testament. 21 letters follow, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, and the rest written by Paul and others to real churches, addressing real problems, division, confusion, persecution, grief, sin. These are not abstract theological essays, they are mail. Think about the last time you wrote a message to someone you loved who was struggling, not a formal essay, but real words written quickly, meant to comfort or correct or encourage someone specific in a specific situation you understood well. That is closer to what these letters actually are than any textbook chapter could ever capture. Urgent, personal, sometimes furious, sometimes tender letters from people who loved the churches they were writing to and were terrified those churches might fall apart without guidance. You can hear Paul's frustration crackle off the page when he writes to the Galatians, and you can hear his tenderness when he writes to the small church in Philippi that had supported him through years of hardship. Other letters carry different voices entirely. Peter, the same fisherman who once denied knowing Jesus 3 times in a single terrifying night, writes to scattered, suffering believers with the authority of a man who knows exactly what failure and forgiveness both feel like. James writes with blunt, practical urgency about faith that actually changes how you treat people. The writer of Hebrews, whose name the library itself never records, walks through the entire Old Testament sacrificial system to explain why it was always pointing toward something greater than itself. And then at last you arrive back where you started. Patmos, the old man on the rock. By the time John writes the final book of this library, he is the last living apostle, exiled for refusing to be quiet about what he witnessed decades earlier. Every other apostle who once walked beside him is already gone, most of them killed for the same stubborn refusal to stay silent. And on that island he sees a vision. The Greek word is apocalypsis, and here is what almost everyone gets wrong about that word. It does not primarily mean destruction, it means unveiling. A curtain pulled back. Revelation is not first a book about the end of the world. It is first a book about seeing clearly what has been true the entire time. And in the vision John records, in the final pages of the final book of this entire library, he describes a city, a river, and a tree of life, and God dwelling with his people at last, face to face, with no more tears and no more night. The city he describes has gates that are never shut, because there is nothing left outside worth locking anyone out from. The tree of life bears fruit every single month, and its leaves are, in John's own words, for the healing of the nations. Every wound this library has tracked since Genesis, every exile, every grief, every unanswered prayer from the Psalms is answered here, in the very last chapter, not with an explanation but with a restoration. Now here is the sentence you have been waiting for. Go back, all the way back, to the very first pages of this library, to a garden, to two people walking with God in the cool of the day before anything went wrong. That garden held a tree of life too. It held God's presence, unguarded, unafraid. And then it held a door that closed, and an angel with a flaming sword, and two people walking out into a world that had never known distance from God before that moment. The garden was lost on the first page anyone wrote. And on the very last page, on that island, in an old man's trembling hand, the garden comes back. The tree of life again. The presence of God again. The distance finally fully closed. Notice what did not change across those 1,500 years. Not the ache for closeness, not the persistence of the one doing the pursuing. Every shepherd, every king, every exile, every letter was another step in the same walk back toward that same garden. Think about what that means for a moment. Somewhere between then and now, you have likely received a long letter or a long string of messages from someone who loved you, written across years, in pieces, through good seasons and hard ones, and only once you reached the very last page did you finally understand everything they had been trying to tell you the whole time. That is what this library is doing to you. 1,500 years, 40 authors, 66 books. One sentence, spoken in 100 different ways. I have not left. I have not forgotten. I am coming back for what I lost. So here is what you actually have, now that you have walked from the garden to the island and back again. Takeaway 1. The Bible is not 66 random books bound together by accident. It is a library with a plan, law, history, poetry, prophets, gospels, letters, revelation, each section handing the story to the next. Across 1,500 years and more than 40 authors who mostly never met each other and still, somehow, never lost the thread. Takeaway 2. Every single person you met in this library was unfinished. Moses stuttered and argued. David danced and wept and failed. Job demanded answers he never fully got. Even the disciples misunderstood almost everything until the very end. If you have ever felt too unfinished, too messy, too far behind to belong in a story like this, you are, according to every book in this library, exactly the kind of person it was written for. And takeaway 3, the one to sit with after this video ends. That garden you lost, if you have ever felt the ache of something good slipping away and never quite returning, was never the end of the story. The very last page of this library ties itself back to the very first one, on purpose, written by an old man on a rock who had nothing left but a pen, a vision, and a promise that the door closes on nobody's exile forever. Which book in this video hit you the hardest? Tell me below and tell me why. For 2,000 years, people have called this collection of 66 books many things: a library, a canon, a collection of scrolls. But maybe the simplest word is still the truest one: a letter. 1,500 years in the writing, addressed from the very first page to you.